The humid Miami night pressed against the windows of Ethan Caldwell's sleek black SUV as he navigated the familiar streets of Coral Gables. At 50, Ethan was a man who had carved his place in the world with steady hands and a sharper mind. His construction empire, Caldwell Builds, was a testament to his relentless drive, born from years of grinding through late nights and early mornings. From a modest start in his 20s, he turned a small contracting gig into a powerhouse that shaped Miami's skyline, earning him respect in an industry where trust was hard-won. His reputation wasn't just for delivering projects on time, but for his quiet integrity, a man who kept his word, paid his workers fairly, and never cut corners. Ethan's life had been one of discipline. He'd always preferred the hum of a work site to the chaos of crowded bars or loud parties. Socializing drained him. He found comfort in the solitude of blueprints and budgets. In his younger years, there had been a few fleeting romances, brief sparks that fizzled out under the weight of his focus on work. He wasn't cold, just guarded, his shyness often mistaken for aloofness. Friends urged him to loosen up, to chase something beyond contracts and concrete, but Ethan brushed them off. He'd built a life most envied. Luxury cars, a waterfront home, vacations to places he'd once only seen in magazines. Yet, deep down, a quiet void lingered, a sense that something essential was missing. That changed 7 years ago at a charity gala in downtown Miami. Ethan had agreed to sponsor the event, a fundraiser for a local children's hospital, more out of duty than desire. He'd stood at the edge of the room, nursing a glass of bourbon, watching the crowd mingle under chandeliers. That's when he saw Sophia Alvarez. At 45, she was a force, vibrant, with a laugh that cut through the room's hum and a way of speaking that drew people in. She was a real estate agent, confident and warm, her dark eyes holding a mix of kindness and determination. Ethan, usually content to stay on the sidelines, found himself drawn to her orbit. Their first conversation started over a shared joke about the gala's overpriced wine. Sophia's ease disarmed him, and for the first time in years, Ethan felt himself relax. She talked about her love for travel, stories of hiking in Peru, getting lost in Tokyo markets, and he found himself sharing details he rarely voiced, his pride in building a community center for underprivileged kids, the way he'd taught himself to read architectural plans as a teenager. By the end of the night, they'd exchanged numbers, and Ethan drove home with a rare smile, replaying her words in his mind. What followed was a whirlwind, but not the chaotic kind. Sophia brought a steadiness to his life, a balance he hadn't known he needed. They met for coffee at a quiet Coconut Grove cafe, then dinners at hole-in-the-wall spots where she'd tease him for overanalyzing the menu. With her, Ethan didn't feel the need to hide his quieter side. She saw through his reserved exterior, coaxing out stories of his early struggles and dreams he'd buried under years of work. For the first time, he felt understood, not for his success, but for who he was beneath it. 6 months later, Ethan knew he wanted her in his life forever. The proposal was simple, just the two of them on a quiet beach at sunset. No grand gestures, just a question and a ring. Sophia's eyes welled up as she said yes, her smile brighter than the fading light. But even in that moment of joy, Ethan's pragmatism held firm. He'd seen too many deals go sour, too many promises broken in the business world. Before the wedding, he insisted on a prenuptial agreement with total separation of assets. It wasn't about distrust, he explained, but about protecting what he'd built. Sophia hesitated, her expression tightening for a moment, but she nodded, signing the papers with a quiet resolve. Ethan took it as a sign of her commitment, believing their love was strong enough to weather any storm. Their marriage settled into a rhythm. Sophia brought warmth to their waterfront home, hosting small dinners for friends, while Ethan focused on expanding his business. They were a team, or so he thought, balancing each other's strengths. He trusted her, leaned on her, and for the first time, felt like his life was complete. But as he drove through the neon-lit streets that night, a faint unease stirred. A memory, a detail, something small but sharp, was about to unravel everything he'd built. Not just his marriage, but the belief that he could ever truly let his guard down. Ethan Caldwell's SUV rolled to a stop at a red light on Ocean Drive, the neon glow of South Beach flickering across the windshield. The Miami night buzzed outside, but inside, his mind was elsewhere, replaying the moment that had cracked the foundation of his carefully built life. At 50, Ethan had learned to trust his instincts, honed by years of navigating high-stakes deals in the construction world. Now, those instincts were screaming that something was wrong, something that started with a single, seemingly trivial detail. He'd just returned from a week-long business trip to New York, where he'd secured a multi-million-dollar contract for a new high-rise in downtown Miami. Exhausted but triumphant, he'd walked into their Coral Gables home expecting the usual warmth from Sophia, his wife of 7 years. She'd greeted him with a smile, a kiss, and a glass of his favorite bourbon, but something felt off. As he settled into the living room, the TV was on, tuned to a golf tournament. The sight stopped him cold. Sophia had always mocked golf, calling it a snooze fest for retirees. She'd never watch it, not even out of boredom. Yet there it was, the channel logo glowing in the corner of the screen. Ethan didn't confront her. Instead, he asked casually, almost as an afterthought, if anyone had been over while he was gone. Sophia's response came too quickly, her laugh a touch too bright. "Just me and the cat," she said, turning to pour herself a glass of wine. But Ethan caught the slight hitch in her voice, the way her eyes flicked away for a fraction of a second. He'd spent years reading subcontractors and clients, spotting lies in their hesitations. Sophia wasn't herself, and that realization lodged in his chest like a splinter. By morning, the unease had grown into a quiet resolve. Ethan wasn't a man to act on impulse, but he wasn't one to ignore a warning either. Over breakfast, he kept the conversation light, asking about her week, nodding at her stories about a new real estate client and a yoga class she'd tried. But his mind was already working, calculating. After clearing his plate, he kissed her goodbye and drove to his office in Brickell, where he made a call he'd never imagined needing. A contact in the industry had once recommended a private investigator, a man named Victor Ruiz, known for discretion and results. Ethan dialed, his voice steady as he laid out his suspicions. Ruiz listened, asked a few pointed questions, and agreed to start immediately. "Give me a week," he said. "If there's something to find, I'll find it." Ethan knew he needed a way to test the waters without tipping Sophia off. That afternoon, he told her about a sudden 3-day trip to Atlanta to meet with investors. It was a lie, but a convincing one. He even packed a suitcase, tossing in a few shirts and his laptop for show. Sophia's reaction was textbook, supportive, a little wistful, wishing him luck with a hug that felt just a shade too rehearsed. "Be safe," she said, her smile as warm as ever. Ethan nodded, climbed into his SUV, and drove not to the airport, but to a modest condo he kept near his office for late-night work sessions. It was sparse, just a bed, a desk, and a coffee maker, but it was the perfect place to stay out of sight. The first night in the condo passed slowly. Ethan tried to focus on project proposals, but his thoughts kept drifting to Sophia. He replayed their years together. The way she'd laugh at his terrible attempts at cooking, how she'd convinced him to dance at a friend's wedding despite his protests. Those memories clashed with the image of that golf channel, the flicker of doubt in her eyes. He didn't want to believe she'd betray him, but he'd seen too many deals fall apart to trust blind faith. His phone sat on the desk, silent, as he waited for Ruiz's update. By morning, the investigator's message came through, brief and urgent. "Call me. Now." Ethan's pulse quickened as he dialed. Ruiz's voice was calm, but direct. "Your wife's not alone. There's a guy at your house. Showed up last night. Stayed over. I've got photos, license plate, the works. Name's Marcos Rivera, real estate broker, her ex from way back. Want me to keep digging?" Ethan's grip tightened on the phone, but his voice stayed even. "Yes. Get everything you can. I'll handle the rest." He hung up, staring at the condo's blank walls. Marcos. The name hit like a punch he hadn't seen coming. Sophia had mentioned him once or twice, a fleeting part of her past, someone she'd dated years before Ethan. She dismissed him as a selfish hothead, hardly worth mentioning. Yet now, he was in Ethan's home, in their life. The betrayal wasn't just a suspicion anymore. It was real, and it was close. Ethan didn't let anger take over. Instead, a cold clarity settled in. He'd built his empire by staying 3 steps ahead, and he wasn't about to lose control now. He grabbed his keys and headed for his car, his plan already forming. He wouldn't confront Sophia yet, not without proof in hand, not without knowing every angle. As he drove toward Coral Gables, the Miami skyline loomed in the distance, a reminder of everything he'd built and everything now at risk. The truth was waiting, and Ethan was ready to face it, no matter how much it hurt. Ethan Caldwell's SUV idled 2 houses down from his Coral Gables home. The quiet street bathed in the soft glow of streetlights. The Miami night was still, but inside Ethan, a storm was brewing, not of rage, but of cold, calculated resolve. At 50, he'd faced enough betrayals in business to know that emotions clouded judgment. The call from Victor Ruiz, the private investigator, had confirmed his worst suspicions. Sophia, his wife of 7 years, was with her ex, Marcos Rivera, in their home. Ethan's home, the place where he'd let his guard down, believing he'd found something real. Now, he was minutes away from confronting the truth. He stepped out of the car, his movements deliberate, and crossed the lawn with the silent focus of a man who'd spent decades planning every move. The investigator's photos, sent to his phone, burned in his mind. Marcos's car in the driveway, the two of them entering the house together. Ethan didn't need to see more to know what was happening, but he wasn't here to assume. He needed evidence, undeniable and ironclad, to close this chapter without leaving room for doubt. The key turned smoothly in the lock, and he slipped inside, his footsteps silent on the hardwood floor. The house was dark, save for a faint light spilling from the hallway leading to the bedroom. Ethan's pulse was steady, his breathing controlled, as he moved toward it. He'd built his construction empire by anticipating risks, and now he applied that same precision to this moment. He paused outside the closed bedroom door, listening. No voices, no movement, just the soft hum of the air conditioner. For a fleeting second, he considered turning back, letting the illusion of his marriage linger a little longer. But that wasn't who he was. Ethan didn't run from hard truths. He turned the doorknob and pushed the door open. The scene was stark, almost clinical in its clarity. Sophia lay asleep on the bed, her dark hair spilling across the pillow. Next to her, Marcos, his arm draped carelessly over her, slept soundly. The sight hit Ethan like a physical blow, but he didn't flinch. He pulled out his phone, opened the camera, and snapped several photos, sharp, unmistakable images that captured every detail. The time, the place, the two of them together. The evidence was as cold and final as a signed contract. Ethan stepped back, his expression unreadable, and clapped his hands twice, the sound sharp enough to jolt the room. Sophia's eyes flew open, her face draining of color as she registered Ethan standing in the doorway. Marcos jolted upright, disoriented, his eyes darting between Ethan and the scattered clothes on the floor. "What the?" he stammered, scrambling to grab his jeans. Ethan didn't move, didn't speak, just watched with a calm that felt almost unnatural. Marcos stumbled past him, muttering apologies that dissolved into the hallway as he fled, the front door slamming behind him. Sophia sat frozen, clutching the sheet to her chest, her breath uneven. "Ethan," she started, her voice breaking. Tears welled in her eyes, but Ethan raised a hand, cutting her off. "Don't," he said, his tone low and firm. "Get dressed. Get your things. You're leaving. Now." Her mouth opened, then closed, as if searching for words that could undo what he'd seen. She tried again, her voice trembling. "It was a mistake. I swear, it didn't mean anything. Please, let me explain." Ethan didn't respond, his gaze steady, unyielding. He'd heard enough excuses in boardrooms to know when words were just noise. Sophia's pleas grew desperate, her hands shaking as she pulled on a sweater and jeans. "I was lonely," she said, tears streaming down her cheeks. "You're always working, always gone. I didn't mean for this to happen." Ethan remained silent, his silence louder than any accusation. He stepped aside as she grabbed a bag, shoving in a few essentials: phone, keys, a handful of clothes, her movements frantic, as if speed could outrun the consequences. She paused at the door, turning to face him, her eyes searching for a crack in his resolve. "Ethan, please. We can fix this. I love you." For a moment, something flickered in him. 7 years of memories, of laughter and late nights, of believing she was his partner in every sense. But the photos on his phone, the reality of Marcos in their bed, snuffed it out. "You have 1 hour," he said. "Someone will come tomorrow for the rest of your things. Don't be here when they arrive." Sophia's shoulders slumped, her sobs muffled as she stepped into the night, the door closing behind her with a finality that echoed in the empty house. Ethan stood alone, the weight of the moment settling over him. He didn't feel anger or triumph, just a hollow clarity. The life he'd built with Sophia was over, but this was only the beginning. He'd learned long ago that betrayal, if handled right, could be a catalyst. As he locked the door and returned to his phone, scrolling through the photos, Ethan knew one thing for certain. He wasn't done yet. Ethan Caldwell sat at his desk in his Brickell office, the Miami skyline stretching beyond the window. At 50, he'd built his construction empire by turning setbacks into opportunities, and now, with the sting of Sophia's betrayal still fresh, he was ready to act. The photos on his phone, Sophia and her ex, Marcos Rivera, caught in their shared betrayal, were more than proof of infidelity. They were the spark for a plan that would ensure justice, not through rage, but through the law. Ethan didn't believe in reckless vengeance. He believed in precision. The morning after he'd confronted Sophia, Ethan met with his lawyer, Claudia Hernandez, a sharp-minded litigator known for dismantling opponents in court. He laid out the situation, the affair, the photos, and the nagging suspicion that Marcos's presence wasn't just personal. Victor Ruiz, the private investigator, had sent a follow-up report that raised red flags. Marcos, a real estate broker, had been digging into Ethan's business dealings, asking questions about upcoming projects during late-night calls with Sophia. Ethan suspected she'd shared sensitive details, timelines, budgets, client names, that could compromise his company. Claudia leaned forward, her pen tapping a notepad. "If there's evidence of misuse of confidential information, we can hit him hard," she said. "The affair gives you grounds for a clean divorce. But if Marcos is playing dirty with your business, we can go further. The RICO Act could apply. Racketeering, fraud, conspiracy. It's a big swing, but the payoff could be massive." Ethan nodded, his face unreadable. "Find out what he's done. I want every angle covered." Ruiz's investigation moved fast. Within days, he uncovered a paper trail linking Marcos to shady real estate deals. Marcos had used insider knowledge, likely fed by Sophia, about Ethan's upcoming condo project in Wynwood to secure competing bids with a rival developer. Bank records showed unusual transfers to an offshore account, and emails revealed Marcos had misrepresented himself as a consultant to access Ethan's client lists. It wasn't just betrayal. It was a calculated attempt to undermine Ethan's business for profit. Armed with this, Claudia filed for divorce first, citing irreconcilable differences backed by the photos of Sophia and Marcos. The prenuptial agreement, signed 7 years ago, was airtight. Total separation of assets meant Sophia would walk away with nothing from Ethan's empire. The divorce hearing was swift. Sophia's lawyer tried to argue emotional distress, claiming Ethan's long work hours had driven her astray, but the judge wasn't swayed. The photos, time-stamped and indisputable, sealed her fate. Sophia left the courtroom with only her personal belongings, her eyes downcast, her future uncertain. But Ethan's focus was on Marcos. Claudia drafted a federal lawsuit under the RICO Act, accusing Marcos of conspiracy to commit fraud and illicit enrichment. The evidence was damning. Text messages between Marcos and a rival developer, financial records tying him to illegal profits, and testimony from a former colleague who'd overheard Marcos bragging about insider tips from Sophia. The lawsuit claimed commercial damages to Caldwell Builds and moral harm to Ethan, seeking millions in compensation. The case hit the Miami business community like a shockwave. Local news outlets picked up the story, framing it as a scandal involving a prominent real estate broker. Marcos's defense was weak, leaning on claims of personal vendetta, but the paper trail was too strong. In court, Claudia presented the evidence with surgical precision, dates, dollar amounts, and direct quotes from Marcos's emails. The judge ruled in Ethan's favor, ordering Marcos to pay $2 million in damages and freezing his assets, pending a criminal investigation into fraud and tax evasion. Marcos's real estate license was revoked, his reputation shattered. Ethan watched the proceedings from the back of the courtroom, his expression calm but resolute. Sophia, who tried contacting Marcos after the divorce, was met with silence. He blamed her for his downfall, cutting her off entirely. She was left to piece together a new life, renting a room from a friend. Her once vibrant confidence eroded. Ethan, meanwhile, redirected the compensation into his company, funding a new project that would break ground in Fort Lauderdale. The betrayal had cost him a marriage, but it hadn't broken him. Instead, it sharpened his focus, reminding him why he'd always trusted his instincts over his heart. As he left the courthouse, Ethan felt no joy in Marcos's ruin or Sophia's defeat, just a quiet satisfaction that justice had been served. The game wasn't over, though. He knew the final piece was ensuring his empire was untouchable, and he was already planning his next move. Ethan Caldwell stood on the construction site of his latest project in Fort Lauderdale, the hum of machinery and the sharp scent of fresh concrete filling the air. At 50, he was no stranger to rebuilding. First his business, now his life. The $3. $2 million from a lawsuit against Marcos Rivera, Sophia's ex and his betrayer, was already fueling this new high-rise, a sleek tower that would redefine the city's skyline. The betrayal that had shattered his marriage hadn't broken him. It had sharpened his resolve, turning pain into a catalyst for triumph. As he surveyed the site, Ethan felt a quiet certainty. Some endings were just the start of something greater. The fallout from Sophia's affair and Marcos's fraud had unfolded swiftly. The divorce, backed by the ironclad prenup, left Sophia with nothing but her personal belongings. She tried to reach out once, sending a long email filled with apologies and pleas for a second chance. Ethan read it, then deleted it without replying. Her words were hollow, unable to erase the image of her with Marcos in their bed. She'd moved out of Miami, last he heard, crashing with a friend in Orlando, her once vibrant real estate career stalled by the scandal shadow. Ethan didn't dwell on her fate. His focus was forward, not back. Marcos's downfall was more public. The RICO lawsuit, expertly handled by Ethan's lawyer, Claudia Hernandez, had gutted his reputation. The court's ruling, $3. $2 million in damages, frozen assets, and a revoked real estate license, was only the start. Federal investigators had picked up the trail, charging Marcos with fraud and tax evasion based on the same evidence Ethan's team uncovered. Local news ran stories about the Miami real estate scam, painting Marcos as a cautionary tale. He tried to deflect blame, even accusing Sophia of entrapment, but no one bought it. His calls to her went unanswered. He was alone, facing years in prison. Ethan, meanwhile, was thriving. The compensation from the lawsuit became seed money for Caldwell Build's expansion. Beyond the Fort Lauderdale Tower, he'd secured contracts for 2 new projects in Tampa and Phoenix, each one cementing his company's dominance in the Southeast. The scandal, rather than tarnishing his name, had bolstered it. Clients admired his restraint, his ability to turn a personal betrayal into a professional victory without stooping to petty revenge. At a recent industry gala, a competitor raised a glass to him, half joking, "You're untouchable, Caldwell." Ethan just nodded, a faint smile on his lips. But success wasn't just about contracts. Ethan had spent years building walls around himself, trusting only his instincts and his work. Sophia's betrayal had cracked that armor, forcing him to confront the cost of his isolation. He didn't swear off love or vow to stay alone, but he approached life differently now. He started mentoring young entrepreneurs at a local business incubator, sharing the lessons he'd learned the hard way. At one session, a 20-something architect thanked him for advice on navigating a tough deal, and Ethan felt a spark of purpose he hadn't known he'd missed. Work was still his anchor, but he was learning to connect, to let people in, not too close but close enough. One evening, as he walked the site after the crew had left, Ethan's phone buzzed with a message from Victor Ruiz, the investigator. It was a brief update. Marcos had taken a plea deal, facing 5 years in prison. Sophia had been spotted working a low-level admin job in Orlando, far from the glamorous life she'd once led. Ethan pocketed the phone without responding. Their fates were no longer his concern. He'd played his hand, calmly, legally, decisively, and won. The weight of their betrayal had lifted, replaced by a clarity he hadn't felt in years. Standing on a half-built foundation, Ethan looked out at the horizon, where the ocean met the sky. He thought of the charity gala, where he'd met Sophia, the nights they'd spent planning a future that never came. Those memories didn't sting anymore. They were just data, lessons in what to guard against. He'd rebuilt his life once before, from nothing to an empire. Now he was doing it again, not out of necessity, but choice. The tower rising around him was more than concrete and steel. It was proof that betrayal could break a marriage but not a man. As he drove back to his Coral Gables home, The Miami lights streaking past, Ethan felt a quiet triumph. He turned a personal loss into a professional gain, not through anger, but through strategy. The world hadn't stopped turning, and neither would he. There were new deals to close, new heights to reach, and a life to live on his terms. For Ethan, this wasn't just the end of a chapter, it was the start of a legacy.